Are you tired of wrestling with warped boards? There's a simple way to flatten boards, even if you don't have a planer. In this video, we're building this slab flattening jig, which will revolutionize your woodworking projects. First things first, determine the size of the rails you want to make. In my case, I'm going to create a rail that is 6 feet long to fit on my workbench, and I'm going to make it 2 inches high. To determine the height of the rails, the first thing I did is I installed the bit that I'm using into my router, and I set the router so that the bit was protruding as far from the base as it could. And in this case, my bit is protruding 1 3/4 inches. The next thing I did is I put together this drawing to see how much cutting depth I could get. So I have the 3/4 inch, which will be the base of the cradle. We'll show you how to make that in a minute. And then I had to subtract that from the 1 3/4 inches that I have, and it leaves me with 1 inch of cutting depth here. If I wanted to cut a board down to 1 inch thick, that means I could use a 2-inch rail. Now, if I'm using thinner boards, I can stack some plywood underneath to raise the board up. And if I'm going to go with thicker boards, I could stack some plywood boards underneath the rails to raise them up, and I'll show you what that looks like. One more thing about this bit. You'll notice that it's got both vertical and horizontal cutters. This is a decent bit for using. This is 1.5 inches wide, which is a decent size pass. You can get these bits anywhere from $50 to $200. I got a $50 version, which worked perfect for me. I love this bit. I got it on Amazon. I'll put a link in the description. So here you can see I'm using plywood and I'm cutting it down into 2-inch strips. I recommend using plywood over some kind of a hardwood. You don't have to deal with contraction, expansion with the seasonal changes and changes in humidity. I'll use the 2-inch strips to make up my rails, and I'll also use 2-inch strips around the sides of my cradle. Now that all the parts are cut out, all you need to do is glue and screw the sides to the base plate. So as you can see, we've got the rails built, and I have them clamped to the sides of my workbench. So now you have a nice, even, smooth surface to build your cradle to run across. As I mentioned, if you're working with thicker pieces of wood, you can raise these up by putting blocks of plywood underneath on either end and reclamping it so that you can work with a thicker piece of wood. Just like so. And you would obviously do that on both sides. To determine the cradle size, the first thing I did was determine how wide I want the cradle. And to do that, I measured the width of my router base, which in my case is 6 inches. And then I'm going to add 1.5 inches for the thickness of the sides, the 3/4 inch plywood sides, and then I'll add 1/8 of an inch just to make sure that it's not snug on the router. You want it to be able to move freely. So 7 5/8 wide. And then I'll make it 36 inches long because my workbench is 30 inches deep, and that'll give me a 3-inch overhang on each side. Now that you've got your pieces cut out for the cradle, you just have to glue and screw the 2-inch pieces around the sides so that you can create your box. I took the router base and a pencil and I used it to draw where I need to cut a slot in the bottom of the cradle. This doesn't have to be exact. You'll have some room for play, so don't worry about it being exact. You want to just make sure the slot's wide enough for the bit to get through without hitting the sides. I use a hole saw to cut out each end, and then using a jigsaw, I'll connect the 2 holes together to cut the slot. Once you got the slot cut out, a light sanding, and then apply a nice liberal coat of paste wax. This Johnson's paste wax stuff is fantastic for making this slide. So you'll see I'm putting a liberal amount on here, and then once I'm done, I do a test with the base just to make sure it slides and it's unencumbered. And that's all there is to building the jig. Now that we've got the jig built, let's show you how to use it. Take your piece of wood and lay it on the bench. Make sure it's level on the bench. I like to use hot glue, just a little bit on each of the corners, just to hold it in place and keep it from moving around. Once you set the depth of cut with your router, you want to start taking light passes across the board. A word of caution, like even this router bit said that you can cut up to 1/8 of an inch. I didn't even try that. I want half that. I want 1/16 of an inch at the most. I'd rather take a lot of light passes than take a risk of gouging the wood or having any kind of a kickback or anything from the router. Once you're done making all the passes, vacuum up all of your wood chips, give it a light sanding, and you've got a nice, perfectly flat slab or piece of wood to work with. There you have it, a simple yet effective jig for flattening slabs. If you found this video helpful, please give it a thumbs up and subscribe for more woodworking tips and tricks. If you have questions or suggestions, please drop them below in the comments. Happy woodworking!